Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we chase a sultan through a forest at dawn, and we do it nose first. Picture it. Late 17th century, somewhere in the Thracian woodlands outside Edirne. Mist clings low to the grass. Dogs bay somewhere off to your left, and you can smell them before you see them. Wet fur, hot breath, the mineral tang of blood already on the air from an earlier kill. You're trailing behind a young man on horseback who's been riding since before the sun came up, and he reeks. Not in a cartoonish way, in a very real, very human way. Sweat has soaked through layers of silk and wool. His boots are packed with mud and something worse. This is Sultan Mehmed IV, ruler of the Ottoman Empire, and historians still argue about a great many things concerning him. But nobody argues about this. The man loved to hunt, and hunting in the 17th century was an extraordinarily unhygienic hobby. You probably won't survive a single week of his actual daily routine, and that's saying something, because this was a man who had access to some of the most luxurious perfumes on the planet.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I like knowing where in the world you're drifting off tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's the thing about Mehmed IV that gets buried under all the political history. He was nicknamed Avcı, which simply means the hunter. Not a poetic epithet invented centuries later. His own court called him this while he was alive, because the man was by nearly every account obsessed. He would vanish from the capital for weeks, sometimes months, chasing deer and boar and birds across the Balkan countryside, sleeping in tents, eating whatever could be roasted over a fire, and living in conditions that would have horrified the perfumed courtiers he left behind in Istanbul. You trudge along beside his retinue in your imagination, and you notice something. Nobody around him seems bothered by the smell. That's not because 17th century noses were tougher than yours, though honestly they probably had to be. It's because everybody smelled like this. This was an era before regular bathing was a daily habit for most Europeans and Ottomans alike. An era when body odour was simply the ambient hum of human existence, the way traffic noise is for you now. What varied wasn't whether you smelled, it was how you tried to manage it. And manage it the Ottomans did, more than you might expect. The mainstream historical fact worth tucking away here is this. The Ottoman court, unlike many of its European counterparts at the time, had inherited a strong Islamic tradition of ritual cleanliness. Wudu before prayers, regular visits to the hammam, rules about purity that touch nearly every part of daily life. Istanbul was, by the standards of the era, a remarkably bath-happy city. Public bathhouses dotted every neighbourhood. So there's a real tension baked into tonight's story. An empire that prized cleanliness as a spiritual value, ruled by a sultan whose favourite pastime buried him in mud, sweat, and animal blood for weeks at a time. Here's your quirky tidbit for the evening, the kind of detail that never makes it into the textbooks. Contemporary accounts describe hunting camps where servants carried portable rosewater sprinklers, specifically so the Sultan could freshen his hands and face between kills. Imagine that, a man drenched in the honest filth of the chase, pausing every so often so an attendant could mist him with rosewater, like some 17th century spritz bottle. It's almost tender, in a strange way. This small ritual of dignity performed in the middle of chaos. Scholars still debate how much of Mehmed's hunting obsession was genuine passion, and how much was, frankly, an escape. He came to the throne as a child, and children who are handed enormous, terrifying power sometimes look for anywhere else to put their energy. We'll get into that palace, that mother, that 6-year-old boy on a throne much too large for him, very soon. But for tonight, just sit with this first image. A young sultan, sweat-soaked and blood-flecked, riding hard through a Thracian forest, chasing something he could actually catch, in a world where so much else felt uncontrollable. Because that's really what this whole story's about, isn't it? Not just what Mehmed IV smelled like, though we are absolutely going to get into the ambergris, the musk, the soap made from ash and olive oil, all of it, but what the smell tells us about the man underneath. Odour is intimate. It's the one thing you can't fully perform for the history books. Court painters could flatter a sultan's face, poets could flatter his wisdom, nobody could flatter away the smell of 3 weeks in a hunting camp. Remember that detail about the rosewater sprinklers, by the way. We're going to circle back to portable perfumes more than once tonight, because it turns out they were doing a lot of quiet, unglamorous work behind the glitter of empire. For now, let the horses slow to a walk. Let the forest go dim around you. There's a whole childhood we need to wander back through first, a palace thick with incense, a mother with ambitions sharper than any hunting blade, and a little boy who had no idea what kind of empire he was about to inherit. You drift now from the forest back towards stone walls and gilded ceilings, toward the Topkapi palace, where the story of Mehmed actually begins, long before any hunting horn ever called him into the trees. He was born in 1642, inside a palace complex so vast it functioned almost like its own small city, with kitchens and gardens and treasuries, and, tucked deep within it, the harem, a sprawling residential wing that housed the Sultan's family, his consorts, and hundreds of women and children whose lives were bound entirely to the fortunes of the dynasty. And the harem, contrary to a lot of breathless modern imagination, smelled less like some hazy fantasy, and more like an extremely well-run institution trying very hard to mask the ordinary smells of hundreds of human bodies living in close quarters. You walk these corridors in your mind, and the first thing that hits you is incense. Frankincense and aloes wood, burned constantly in braziers, curling up through carved wooden lattices. This wasn't decoration, it was function. Ottoman elites believed strongly in the power of pleasant scent to purify a space, to mark status, to signal that this was a place of order and refinement, a belief with real roots in both Islamic tradition and older Persian and Byzantine court customs the Ottomans had absorbed and refined. The mainstream historical fact for tonight is straightforward. Incense burning in elite Ottoman households was so routine that specific rooms were sometimes designed with the smoke's path in mind, vents and lattices angled to let the fragrant haze drift exactly where it would do the most good. But here's where it gets interesting, and a little grim. Underneath all that curling smoke, the actual day-to-day sanitation of a palace housing hundreds of people was by necessity a constant grinding logistical challenge. Historians still debate exactly how sophisticated Topkapi's waste and water systems were at any given decade, since the palace was renovated and expanded repeatedly across centuries. But we know enough to say this. Keeping a compound this size from smelling like exactly what it was, a dense human settlement, required an army of unglamorous labour. Water carriers, latrine cleaners, laundresses boiling linens in enormous cauldrons. None of these people appear in the flattering court paintings. All of them were essential to why the Sultan's world smelled the way it did. Little Mehmed grew up inside this contradiction without ever really knowing it as a contradiction. To him, this was just how the world smelled. Rosewater and incense layered over the constant hum of human effort keeping the filth at bay. He would have been bathed by attendants from infancy, his skin oiled, his hair scented, his tiny garments perfumed before he ever wore them. This was standard practice for royal children across much of the world at the time, but the Ottomans took particular pride in it, treating the ruler's body, even a baby's body, as something almost sacred, a vessel that needed to be kept pure because it represented the dynasty itself. Here's your quirky tidbit. Infant princes in the Ottoman court were sometimes swaddled in cloth that had been soaked beforehand in diluted rosewater and left to dry, so that even a newborn's first contact with fabric carried that signature palace fragrance. Whether this was done for every royal infant or was more selectively applied to favoured children is something scholars genuinely dispute, since the sources are inconsistent and often written well after the fact by court chroniclers with their own agendas. But the practice, documented in several later accounts, tells you something true, regardless of the specific details. Scent was never neutral in this world. It was status. It was protection. It was almost a kind of swaddling in itself. And yet, for all that fragrant infancy, little Mehmed was born into an empire that was frankly a mess. His father, Sultan Ibrahim, was a deeply unstable ruler whose reign would end in a palace coup and his own execution when Mehmed was barely a toddler. We're not going to dwell on the gorier political details tonight. That's a story for another evening, maybe. But you should know that the perfumed hallways of Mehmed's earliest childhood existed right alongside genuine chaos, plotting, and fear. The smell of frankincense and the smell of anxiety, it turns out, can occupy the very same room. There's a phrase Ottoman court chroniclers used, loosely translated to describe periods like this. Something like, the air itself grew heavy. Whether that was meant literally, given all that incense smoke thickening in enclosed stone rooms, or purely as a poetic flourish for political dread, we genuinely cannot know for certain. Language from 400 years ago doesn't always translate its intentions cleanly, but it's a lovely, eerie image to sit with as you drift. Heavy air, thick with both perfume and unspoken danger, settling over a palace where a small boy was being raised to rule an empire he didn't yet understand. Because rule it he would, far sooner than anyone expects for a child. And the woman who would make absolutely sure of that, his grandmother, and soon enough his mother, locked in one of the fiercest behind-the-scenes power struggles the Ottoman court ever produced, is exactly where we're headed next. Let's talk about the woman who actually got Mehmed onto that throne, because without her tonight's entire story simply doesn't happen. Her name was Turhan Hatise, and she was Mehmed's mother, though not initially the most powerful woman in the palace. That title belonged for years to Sultan Sultan, Mehmed's grandmother, a formidable political operator who had already outlived and outmaneuvered multiple sultans, and who had absolutely no intention of handing real power over to some upstart younger woman just because that woman happened to have given birth to the next heir. What followed was one of the most vicious harem power struggles in Ottoman history, and yes, it eventually turned lethal. Kösem was strangled in a palace intrigue in 1651, when Mehmed was barely 9 years old, in a plot most historians attribute to Turhan and her allies, among the palace eunuchs and janissary commanders. We're not dwelling on the bloodshed tonight, though. Remember, this is a hygiene and smell story wearing a documentary costume, so let's follow that thread instead, because it leads somewhere genuinely fascinating. You have to understand something about status in the Ottoman court. It was worn quite literally on the skin. The quality and quantity of perfume a woman could access, the type of soap used in her bath, the frequency with which fresh linens were brought to her chambers. These weren't just comforts, they were signals, understood by everyone in the palace, of exactly where a person stood in the hierarchy. When Turhan Hatise began consolidating power after Kösem's death, one of the quiet but telling changes recorded by palace administrators was in the allocation of luxury goods, including fragrant oils and imported soaps, to different wings of the harem. Historians debate how deliberately symbolic this reallocation was versus simple bureaucratic reshuffling, but the pattern is documented in surviving palace ledgers, and it's hard not to read it as a kind of perfumed changing of the guard. Mehmed became Sultan in 1648, at 6 years old, following the deposition and execution of his father. 6 years old. Try to sit with that for a second. A boy who, by all rights, should have been more concerned with toys and lessons was instead being dressed in ceremonial robes, seated on a throne built for adult bodies, and presented to a court of grown men who now had to bow to him. Contemporary accounts, and later folk memory, described the young sultan as visibly overwhelmed during his accession ceremony, which frankly seems like the only reasonable reaction a 6-year-old could possibly have. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth holding on to. Because Mehmed was so young at his accession, actual governance was handled for years by a regency council dominated first by tensions between Kösem and Turhan, and later, once Turhan secured her position, by a series of powerful grand viziers. We'll meet the most consequential of them, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, a little later tonight. The boy sultan was, in very real terms, a figurehead for the first stretch of his reign, paraded through ceremonies and prayers while adults fought the actual battles of statecraft around him. And here's your quirky, slightly unsettling tidbit for tonight. Ottoman court protocol required that the sultan, even a child sultan, be ritually purified before major ceremonies, which meant elaborate bathing rituals performed by attendants specifically before Mehmed's public appearances. Picture it. A 6-year-old boy, exhausted, probably terrified, being scrubbed, oiled and perfumed by adult attendants in the hours before he had to sit still on an enormous throne and receive the loyalty of grown men twice his age or more. There's something almost heartbreaking in that image, buried under all the ceremonial gold. Turhan Hatise, once secure in power, became known for her own particular relationship with scent and cleanliness. She reportedly favoured specific rosewater blends from Damascus over locally produced varieties, a preference that some later chroniclers framed as evidence of her refined taste, and others framed, less charitably, as evidence of extravagance during a period when the imperial treasury was under real strain from ongoing wars. Which interpretation is closer to the truth is, honestly, still disputed among historians, and probably says as much about the biases of whoever's writing as it does about Turhan herself. What's not disputed is this. The woman ran the show for years, shaping the empire her son would eventually rule in his own right, and she did it from deep inside a harem culture where fragrance, cleanliness and power were braided together so tightly that you genuinely cannot pull them apart without losing something true about how this world actually worked. So as young Mehmed grew, freshly bathed and dressed for ceremony after ceremony, he was absorbing something that would follow him his whole life. The understanding that a ruler's body had to be presented, perfumed, purified, performed. Long before he ever chased a single boar through a Thracian forest, he was already learning that being sultan meant his very skin belonged in some sense to the empire, and soon we're going to step deeper into the harem itself, into the actual daily hygiene rituals, the ash soap, the shared bathhouses, the surprisingly strict rules that shaped not just Mehmed, but everyone who lived within those perfumed, complicated walls. Let's slow right down now and step inside the hammam, the bathhouse, because this is where the real, unglamorous mechanics of Ottoman hygiene actually lived, tucked behind all that perfumed political theatre we've been wandering through. You walk through a heavy wooden door into a room thick with steam, and the light comes from small star-shaped openings cut into a domed ceiling, scattering soft beams down through the haze. This wasn't unique to the palace. Hammams like this existed all across the empire in nearly every neighbourhood of Istanbul, open to ordinary people on a daily basis. But the harem's private bathhouses were something else entirely. Marble-lined, heated by an elaborate underfloor system called a hypocaust, essentially an ancient form of radiant heating that Ottoman architects had inherited and refined from earlier Byzantine and Roman engineering. Here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight. Regular bathing wasn't a luxury indulgence in Ottoman culture the way it often was in contemporary Western Europe. It was religiously mandated. Islamic practice required ritual washing, ghusl, after certain bodily events, and general cleanliness was considered a matter of faith, not just comfort. So while a French courtier at Versailles, in this exact same era, might go weeks without a proper bath, relying instead on perfume and powder to mask the smell, a genuinely documented historical contrast. The women and men of the Ottoman court were bathing with real regularity, often multiple times a week, sometimes more. Inside the harem's hammam, the actual cleaning process was fairly involved. Attendants used a coarse mitt called a keys to scrub the skin, sloughing off dead skin and grime in a way that, by contemporary accounts from European travellers who occasionally got glimpses of similar practices, left the skin remarkably smooth. Soap itself was typically made from olive oil combined with wood ash, a genuinely effective cleaning agent, chemically speaking, since the ash provided the alkaline component needed to turn oil into something closer to actual soap. This wasn't some primitive substitute for real soap. It worked. It's essentially the same basic chemistry, cold process saponification, that artisanal soap makers still use today for its gentleness on skin. You probably won't survive the temperature, though. The hottest rooms of a proper hammam were kept extraordinarily warm, hot enough that bathers moved through a sequence of chambers, each progressively warmer, to let their bodies adjust gradually before the deepest heat and steam. Here's your quirky tidbit, the kind of detail that rarely makes it past academic footnotes. Harem hygiene protocols reportedly included specific rules about which combs, towels and bathing implements could be shared and which had to remain strictly personal. Not for reasons of general sanitation as we'd understand germ theory today, since that concept simply didn't exist yet, but for reasons tied to status, ritual purity, and the surprisingly intense social politics of who was permitted to touch whose belongings. In an environment where hundreds of women lived in close proximity, competing for the Sultan's favour and for position within a rigid internal hierarchy, something as small as a shared hairbrush could apparently carry real social weight. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we haven't actually gotten to yet? Don't worry, we're circling toward it. Ottoman and broader Mediterranean beauty practices of this era included a genuinely startling range of cosmetic preparations, some quite sophisticated, others that modern chemistry would raise an eyebrow at. We'll get there. For now, know this. Hair removal was a significant part of harem hygiene culture, typically achieved using a paste made from sugar and lemon or a lime-based depilatory compound, applied and then removed in a process not entirely unlike modern sugaring techniques still used today. Teeth were cleaned using chewed twigs from the arak tree, what's called a miswak, a practice with genuine antibacterial properties that modern dental research has actually validated, even though nobody in the 17th century understood why it worked, only that it did. Historians still disagree about how uniformly rigorous these hygiene standards actually were across the entire harem, versus concentrated primarily among the most favoured, highest status women closest to the Sultan and his mother. Palace records that survive tend to document expenditures for the elite chambers far more thoroughly than for the lower-ranking servants and lesser consorts, which creates an obvious gap in what we can actually verify. It's entirely possible, even likely, that the gleaming, perfumed hammam experience we associate with harem life was considerably more available to some residents than others, with a whole tier of the palace population experiencing something considerably less luxurious day to day. What we can say with confidence is this. Young Mehmed grew up steeped, quite literally, in an environment where cleanliness was constant, ritualised and deeply tied to status, a world of steam and scrubbing and rosewater rinses, and this is precisely the world he would eventually leave behind for weeks at a stretch, riding into muddy forests after boar and deer, trading marble bathhouses for canvas tents. That contrast is going to matter a great deal as we keep going tonight, because it's really the emotional core of who this particular sultan turned out to be. But before we follow him back out into the wilderness, we need to understand the empire itself a little better. The shaky, complicated, occasionally quite smelly world Mehmed was actually inheriting once the ceremonies were over and the real business of ruling began. Before we move forward in Mehmed's life, let's linger just a little longer on the bathhouses and soaps, because there's more texture here worth savouring before we drift onward. Think of this as slowing your breathing down, settling deeper into the pillow. Ottoman soap production by the 17th century had actually become a genuine industry, not just a household craft. Certain cities became renowned for their soap. Aleppo, in particular, was famous across the region for a specific style of soap, enriched with laurel oil alongside the standard olive oil base, producing a firmer bar with a distinctive, almost herbal fragrance. Wealthy Ottoman households, including the palace, imported specialty soaps from these renowned production centres, rather than relying solely on whatever was made locally, treating soap almost the way we might treat a boutique skincare product today. Sourced, specific, a small marker of taste and means. Here's a mainstream historical fact that tends to surprise people. Soap-making guilds in major Ottoman cities were tightly regulated, with quality standards enforced by inspectors who checked that soap makers weren't cutting their product with cheaper, less effective fats, or diluting the alkaline ash content to save money. This wasn't casual homebrewing. It was a regulated craft with real economic stakes, feeding both domestic use and export trade that carried Ottoman soap as far as parts of Europe, where it was sometimes prized as a superior product to what local soap makers were producing. Rosewater deserves its own moment here too, because it wasn't just a palace luxury, it was woven into food, medicine, religious practice, and hygiene all at once. Major rosewater production centres, particularly around Isparta in Anatolia, processed enormous quantities of rose petals during the brief harvest window each spring, using distillation techniques that had been refined over centuries. The palace's rosewater didn't come from some mystical secret source. It came from a genuine agricultural and manufacturing supply chain, harvested by ordinary farmers and processed by skilled distillers, before it ever reached those attendants misting it onto Mehmed's hunting-flushed face. Now, about that crocodile dung sunscreen, we finally arrive at it, and it's every bit as strange as it sounds, though we should be careful with the framing here, because the actual historical record is murkier than the popular retelling suggests. The idea that ancient and medieval Mediterranean cultures used crocodile dung as a skin-lightening or sun-protective cosmetic traces back mostly to certain classical Greek and Roman sources describing Egyptian practices, and it's a claim that has been repeated so often in popular history that it's genuinely difficult to separate solid evidence from centuries of retelling and exaggeration. Whether this practice had any meaningful presence specifically in the 17th century Ottoman court, as opposed to being an older Mediterranean legend the Ottomans would have simply heard about, is honestly disputed, and responsible historians tend to flag it as folklore adjacent, rather than confirmed palace practice. So, fun detail, real historical breadcrumb, but file it under legend rather than fact, and don't picture Mehmed himself slathered in it. What we can say with more confidence is that Ottoman elites did use a range of genuine cosmetic preparations for sun and skin care, many built around ingredients like honey, milk, and various plant oils, alongside kohl for the eyes, a preparation with actual mild antibacterial properties, made from ground galena or other minerals, applied not just for aesthetic reasons, but believed to protect the eyes themselves. Here's your quirky tidbit to actually hold on to tonight, verified rather than legendary. Ottoman court records describe specific scent officers among the palace staff, attendants whose formal responsibility included managing the fragrance of rooms, garments, and, at times, individuals preparing for ceremonial appearances. This wasn't an informal task handed to whoever happened to be nearby. It was an actual specialised role within the sprawling palace bureaucracy, complete with its own supply requisitions and hierarchy. Somewhere in the Ottoman administrative records, quite literally, there is a job title that translates roughly to something like Keeper of Pleasant Smells. Try falling asleep on that thought for a second. An entire bureaucratic position dedicated to making sure the empire's most powerful people smelled the way power was supposed to smell. Historians still debate exactly how this role evolved over the centuries, and how much authority these scent officers actually held compared to other palace staff, since surviving records are fragmentary and scattered across different archival collections. But the role's mere existence tells you something true about how seriously this culture took the sensory experience of power. Smell wasn't an afterthought here, it was managed, staffed, budgeted for. So keep all of this in your mind as we step back out of the hammam now, back out past the soap guilds and the rosewater distilleries, and the scent officers quietly doing their perfumed administrative work, because we're about to look at the wider empire Mehmed actually inherited once childhood ceremonies gave way to real rule. And that empire, as you'll hear, had troubles that no amount of rosewater could mask. Let's widen the frame now, away from bathhouses and perfume officers, out toward the empire itself, because the world young Mehmed was inheriting had problems no amount of rosewater could possibly cover up. The Ottoman Empire of the mid-17th century was enormous, stretching across 3 continents, but it was also, in very real terms, an empire under strain. The treasury was stretched thin by ongoing wars, particularly a grinding, expensive conflict with Venice over control of Crete that would drag on for decades. In fact, the Cretan War had already been running for years by the time Mehmed took the throne, and it would continue on and off for most of his early reign. Wars like this weren't abstract political events happening somewhere far away. They meant strained supply lines, heavier taxation, and periodic waves of economic hardship rippling back through the empire's cities, Istanbul included. And where there's economic hardship and crowded cities, there's also disease, which brings us to a genuinely important mainstream historical fact for tonight. Istanbul, like virtually every major city of this era anywhere in the world, experienced periodic outbreaks of plague. The Ottoman capital had endured devastating plague waves across its history, and while the specific epidemiological details of any single outbreak during Mehmed's reign are debated among historians due to inconsistent record-keeping, the broader pattern is well documented. Plague was a recurring, feared presence in Ottoman urban life throughout the 17th century, not some distant medieval memory, but an active, ongoing threat. This matters enormously for tonight's smell-focused lens, because plague and hygiene were, in the medical thinking of the era, deeply intertwined concepts. Ottoman physicians, drawing on a long tradition of Islamic medicine that had itself preserved and built upon classical Greek medical theory, generally subscribed to a version of miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, corrupted by foul odours rising from filth, standing water and decaying matter. This wasn't unique to the Ottomans. It was essentially the dominant medical framework across most of the world at the time, Europe included. But it meant something very specific and very practical. Managing smell wasn't just about comfort or status. It was, in the medical understanding of the day, an actual matter of public health and survival. You can start to see, then, why Istanbul invested so heavily in things like public bathhouses, why rosewater and incense weren't just indulgent luxuries but were understood, at some level, as genuine protective measures against corrupted air. When palace physicians recommended fumigating rooms with aromatic smoke, they weren't performing empty ritual. They believed sincerely that they were fighting disease itself. Whether this actually worked the way they thought it did is, of course, an entirely different question, but the logic connecting scent to survival was completely genuine to the people living it. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Some Ottoman medical texts from this general period recommended specific, protective, scent combinations during plague outbreaks, often built around vinegar, aromatic herbs, and various resins worn in small pouches or burned in the home. Remedies that bear a striking, almost eerie resemblance to the plague doctor, practices more commonly associated with contemporary Europe, like the beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs. This wasn't coincidence or copying in either direction, most likely. It was two medical traditions independently arriving at similar conclusions because they were working from a broadly similar underlying theory of disease. Beyond plague, the empire Mehmed inherited also grappled with more mundane, chronic sanitation challenges simply tied to the scale of its cities. Istanbul by this period likely held several 100,000 residents. Precise population figures are genuinely disputed among historians, given the limitations of Ottoman census-style records, but by any measure it was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. A city that size generates an enormous continuous volume of waste, and Ottoman urban administration had developed real systems to manage it, designated waste collection points, regulations about where certain trades like tanning or slaughtering could operate specifically because of their smell and runoff, and networks of water channels that, while nowhere near modern sanitation standards, represented genuine, deliberate civic infrastructure rather than chaotic neglect. So this is the world Mehmed actually inherited underneath all the ceremonial gold, an empire fighting expensive wars, vulnerable to periodic plague, governing enormous crowded cities through a hygiene philosophy that took smell itself deadly seriously, not as vanity but as survival strategy. It's a strange layered inheritance for a boy who spent his childhood being bathed and perfumed by attendants in the calm of the harem, largely insulated from exactly these pressures pressing in on the empire beyond the palace walls. As Mehmed grew older and began gradually to take a more active role in his own reign, this was the empire waiting for him, one where the fragrant rituals of the court existed in constant uneasy tension with the much harsher realities just beyond the palace gates. And it's against exactly this backdrop that his hunting obsession, which we glimpsed at the very start of tonight's story, really starts to make a different kind of sense. So let's go back out into those forests now, but with a lot more context behind us this time, and really sit with why the hunter became who he was. As Mehmed moved through his teenage years and into early adulthood, the ceremonial figurehead role he'd occupied as a small child began gradually to shift. Grand Viziers still handled an enormous amount of actual governance. We're going to spend real time with the most important of them very soon. But the young Sultan was no longer purely decorative, and it's right around this period, historians generally agree, that his genuine, borderline obsessive love of hunting really took hold. Contemporary chroniclers describe hunting expeditions that could stretch for weeks, sometimes venturing deep into the countryside of Thrace and beyond, with Mehmed sometimes seeming more invested in the chase than in the affairs of state waiting for him back in the capital. This became enough of a pattern that later historians, and even some of his own contemporaries, openly criticised him for prioritising the hunt over his royal duties, though it's worth noting as a point of genuine scholarly debate that some modern historians push back on this framing, arguing that the obsessive hunter neglecting his empire narrative may have been somewhat exaggerated by later chroniclers looking to explain the empire's struggles during his reign, retroactively pinning blame on a convenient personal flaw, rather than examining more complex structural and political causes. We genuinely can't know for certain how much of this reputation reflects Mehmed's actual priorities versus a useful narrative constructed after the fact. What we can say with real confidence, though, is what hunting actually looked like logistically, and this is where our smell-focused story gets genuinely vivid. These weren't quick day trips. Hunting camps involved substantial infrastructure. Tents, cooking fires, dozens or even hundreds of attendants, hounds, falcons, horses, essentially a mobile miniature court relocated into the wilderness for weeks at a time. And mobile miniature courts, it turns out, still needed their scent officers. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth holding on to. Ottoman sultans on extended hunting trips travelled with a portion of the palace's household staff, specifically assigned to maintain some baseline of royal comfort and presentation, even in field conditions. cooks who could prepare meals meeting court standards, and yes, attendants managing bathing water, fresh linens and perfumes, even out in the mud. This is genuinely documented in Ottoman administrative and travel records, which tracked the considerable expense and logistics involved in moving a sultan's household into temporary field encampments. So Mehmed's world during these hunts was a strange hybrid, genuinely rough, physically demanding conditions layered awkwardly against attempts to maintain the sensory trappings of palace life. You trudge through mud with him, but there's still, somewhere in the camp, someone heating water for a proper wash at day's end. There's still, likely, a servant with rosewater on hand. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight, and it's a good one. Some accounts describe Mehmed developing a reputation, among those closest to him, for actually preferring the rougher, more physically honest conditions of the hunting camp to the heavily perfumed formality of palace life, finding something almost like relief in sweat that was earned through genuine physical effort, as opposed to the performed decorative fragrance constantly expected of him at court. Whether this reflects a real, documented personal preference, or is a flattering interpretation added by chroniclers trying to paint an unflattering, neglectful sultan reputation in a more sympathetic light is, again, genuinely disputed. But it's a compelling read of the man, isn't it? Someone who might have found the honest funk of physical labour more comfortable than the constant sensory performance of rule. There's also a practical medical dimension worth mentioning here, connecting back to what we discussed about plague and miasma theory. Court physicians of the era generally believed that vigorous physical activity and time spent in open, rural air was actually good for one's health, a genuine counterpoint to the crowded, sometimes disease-prone density of the capital. So Mehmed's extended countryside expeditions may have been understood, at least in part, through a genuinely medical lens by his own era, not purely as recreational escape, but as something closer to a health regimen, fresh air and exertion as prescribed wellness, centuries before anyone had a germ theory to properly explain why crowded cities bred disease in the first place. Remember that tension we set up back in the palace, between the perfumed formality of harem life and the harsher realities of the empire beyond its walls? Out here in the hunting camps, that tension plays out on Mehmed's own body, quite literally. Mud and sweat by day, rose water and clean linen by firelight, the two worlds never fully separate, always bleeding into each other. It's a genuinely rich human image to hold on to as we move now toward the more dangerous side of court life. Because while Mehmed was out chasing boar through the countryside back in Istanbul, the machinery of power was turning without him, and not everyone in that machinery had entirely clean intentions. Let's slip back inside the palace walls now, into the corridors where the real, quiet machinery of Ottoman power actually turned. Because court intrigue in this era had its own very particular relationship with scent and with fear. You have to understand that Topkapi Palace functioned as an enormously complex bureaucratic organism, with hundreds of officials, advisors, eunuchs and servants, all navigating an intricate hierarchy where a single misstep, a wrong word, a poorly timed request, an ill-considered alliance could end a career, or worse. And in an environment this dense with social calculation, the sensory details we've been discussing all night, perfume, cleanliness, the scent officers, the careful allocation of luxury soaps, weren't just personal comforts. They were legible signals of status that everyone in the palace was constantly, silently reading off each other. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth sitting with. In the Ottoman court, as in many pre-modern royal courts around the world, physical proximity to the ruler and access to the finer material trappings of court life, including, yes, the better perfumes and the more frequent bathhouse privileges, functioned as a real, visible barometer of political favour. When a courtier's allocation of luxury goods increased, that was read, correctly, as a sign of rising influence. When it quietly decreased, that was read as a warning. Falling out of favour in this world often had a genuinely sensory dimension to it, a slow, visible downgrade in how well you were permitted to smell. Court intrigue during Mehmed's reign was, by any measure, intense. The regency period we discussed earlier, with the vicious struggle between Kusem and Turhan, set an early template for just how lethal palace politics could become, and that pattern didn't simply vanish once Mehmed came of age. Grand viziers rose and fell, sometimes through genuine policy failures, sometimes through the shifting currents of factional rivalry that had very little to do with actual competence. And execution, brutal as it sounds, remained a genuine documented tool of Ottoman political life during this era. Grand viziers who lost the Sultan's confidence, or who became too politically inconvenient, could and sometimes did lose their lives, not as some rare shocking exception, but as an accepted if feared feature of how this system operated. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight, and it's a genuinely eerie one. Some later Ottoman folk traditions held that a sudden, unexplained foul odour in a room, with no obvious physical source, could be interpreted as an omen of impending misfortune or death, a belief loosely connected to older regional superstitions about spirits and bad fortune, announcing themselves through the senses before events actually unfolded. Whether courtiers during Mehmed's own actual reign genuinely subscribed to beliefs this specific, as opposed to this being a broader folk tradition documented more clearly in later centuries and simply projected backward onto this earlier period, is honestly something scholars dispute given how folklore tends to blur across time in the historical record. But true or not as lived belief in this exact era, it tells you something real about the emotional texture of this world, a place where fear was constant enough that people looked for warning signs in absolutely everything, smell very much included. There's a genuinely fascinating structural detail worth mentioning here too. The palace employed an extensive network of eunuchs, particularly the chief black eunuch, who held enormous, often underappreciated administrative and even political authority, serving as a crucial link between the Sultan, the harem, and the broader machinery of court governance. These men occupied a unique position, deeply embedded in the most intimate, sensory-rich spaces of palace life, the bathhouses and private chambers, while simultaneously wielding genuine political influence that rivaled, or sometimes exceeded, that of officially higher-ranked ministers. Their proximity to the literal cleaning and perfuming rituals of royal life gave them a strange, underappreciated form of soft power. They knew things, saw things, controlled access to spaces that ministers meeting in formal council chambers never entered. Mehmed himself, we should note, was navigating all of this while also still developing as a ruler. A young man whose formative years had been shaped by watching his mother and grandmother tear each other's political networks apart, whose own survival to adulthood on the throne was itself not a guarantee in a court where sultans could be, and had recently been, deposed. Historians still debate how much this environment shaped his temperament, whether his eventual retreat into hunting reflected a genuine personality trait, or something closer to a coping strategy, developed by a young man who had grown up steeped in exactly this kind of constant low-grade political dread. What's clear, regardless of the psychological speculation, is that the fragrant, carefully maintained sensory world of the palace existed in constant, uneasy tension, with genuine danger simmering just beneath its polished surface, rosewater and dread, sharing the very same air. And soon we're going to meet the man who did more than perhaps anyone else to actually stabilise this dangerous, complicated court, a Grand Vizier whose family would come to define an entire era of Ottoman governance, and whose own relationship to power was, in its own quiet way, just as carefully managed as any perfumed courtier's. Let's turn now, for a while, to Mehmed's own body, because if we're being honest about tonight's whole premise, we do actually owe you some direct speculation about what the man himself might genuinely have smelled like, filtered through what we actually know about his health, his diet, and the medicine of his era. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts of Mehmed describe him as physically robust for much of his adult life. Unsurprising given how much time he spent on horseback and in the field, vigorous outdoor activity of the kind he engaged in constantly would have shaped his body in ways a modern doctor would recognise immediately. A fit, muscular build, weathered skin from sun exposure, the kind of physical conditioning that came from genuine, sustained exertion rather than ceremonial leisure. Diet matters enormously here too, and Ottoman elite cuisine of this era was rich and varied, built around lamb and other meats, rice, legumes, a wide range of vegetables, and a genuinely impressive array of spices sourced from across an empire that touched 3 continents and sat astride major trade routes. Heavy meat consumption, combined with a specific mix of spices favoured in Ottoman court cooking, cumin, cinnamon, cloves, among others, would have had a real documented influence on body odour, since diet genuinely does shape the compounds released through sweat, something modern research has actually confirmed even if 17th century physicians understood the mechanism completely differently. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth noting. Ottoman court physicians practiced a form of humoral medicine, inherited and adapted from classical Greek medical theory by way of earlier Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina, who understood illness and bodily state through the balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Diet, exercise, bathing, and even scent were all considered legitimate tools for maintaining humoral balance, meaning a sultan's physicians would have genuinely, seriously monitored things we might now consider purely cosmetic, treating strong body odour potentially as a symptom of humoral imbalance, requiring actual medical intervention rather than mere unpleasantness to be masked. We should be honest, too, about the less glamorous realities of 17th century health that would have affected literally everyone in this story, Sultan included. Dental care, despite the genuinely effective miswak twig brushing we mentioned earlier, was nowhere near modern standards, and dental decay and gum disease were extremely common across all social classes of this era, sultans not excepted. There's simply no reason to assume royal status granted some kind of immunity to tooth decay, and it likely didn't. Bad breath from dental issues would have been a near universal experience for adults of this period, regardless of how much rosewater was on hand. Here's your quirky, slightly unexpected tidbit for tonight. Some Ottoman medical texts recommended specific dietary adjustments before important ceremonial occasions, including reduced consumption of certain strong-smelling foods like garlic and onion in the days beforehand. Essentially an early humoral theory version of what modern etiquette guides still recommend before a big meeting or a first date. Whether Mehmed's own kitchen staff genuinely followed protocols this specific before major court appearances is something we can't confirm with certainty for him individually. But the broader practice is documented enough in Ottoman medical and etiquette literature that it's entirely plausible his household observed something similar. We should also address the disputed murkier territory directly, in the spirit of tonight's promise to flag what's uncertain. Later, largely unreliable folk accounts and some politically motivated chronicles written after his eventual deposition occasionally described Mehmed in distinctly unflattering physical terms. Part of a broader pattern, where deposed rulers throughout history often get retroactively described in less dignified ways by writers eager to justify why they were removed from power. Historians treat these particular unflattering physical descriptions with real scepticism, recognising them as likely political character assassination dressed up as physical description, rather than reliable evidence about how Mehmed genuinely looked, smelled, or carried himself during his actual reign at the height of his power. What we can say with genuine confidence, pulling all of this together, is a reasonably grounded picture. A physically fit, sun-weathered man, his body shaped by genuine outdoor exertion, his diet rich in meat and spice in ways that would have left their own subtle signature, his hygiene actively managed by attendants and physicians who took scent seriously as a matter of both status and medical theory, and his breath and skin subject to the same basic realities of 17th century dental and skin care that affected absolutely everyone of his era, palace walls or no palace walls, not some cartoonish stink, and not some impossibly perfumed fantasy either, something recognisably, believably human, sitting right in between. And speaking of perfume specifically, it's finally time to talk properly about the truly expensive stuff. The ambergris, the musk, the substances so valuable they functioned almost as currency in their own right, and the genuinely fascinating political weight they carried at the absolute top of Ottoman society. Let's talk properly now about the good stuff, the truly expensive fragrances that separated an ordinary rosewater rinse from something a sultan might actually reach for on his most important days. Ambergris sits right at the centre of this story, and it deserves a proper introduction because it's genuinely one of history's strangest luxury goods. Ambergris is a waxy substance produced in the digestive systems of sperm whales, expelled and then found, occasionally, washed up on beaches or floating in the ocean after years of aging in salt water and sun, which transforms its initial unpleasant smell into something musky, sweet, and remarkably long-lasting as a fragrance fixative. Nobody in the 17th century fully understood where ambergris actually came from. Theories ranged from sea foam to some kind of exotic underwater fungus. But everybody who could afford it agreed on its value, which was, quite genuinely, comparable to gold by weight in many markets of this era. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth holding on to. Ambergris was used throughout the Ottoman court and across elite circles from Europe to East Asia during this general period, both as a standalone perfume ingredient and as a fixative that made other fragrances last dramatically longer on skin and fabric. Its rarity, since it depended entirely on chance discovery rather than any kind of reliable production, made it a genuine marker of extraordinary wealth and status, something well beyond what an ordinary Ottoman household, however comfortable, could reasonably access. Musk was ambergris' close companion in elite Ottoman perfumery, harvested from a gland found in male musk deer, primarily sourced through long trade networks stretching back toward Central Asia and the Himalayan region. Like ambergris, musk functioned partly as a fixative and partly as a fragrance in its own right, and Ottoman perfumers were genuinely skilled at blending it with rosewater, ambergris and various aromatic oils to create complex layered scents specifically associated with royal and elite use. Here's where the political dimension really comes into focus, and it's a genuinely important mainstream point. The trade routes supplying ambergris and musk to the Ottoman court were themselves matters of real geopolitical significance. Control over key trading ports and the caravan routes bringing these luxury goods westward was tied up with the empire's broader commercial and military strategy, meaning that something as seemingly frivolous as perfume supply was actually threaded into much larger questions of trade policy, diplomatic relationships, and even, at times, military campaigns aimed at securing or protecting valuable trade corridors. Gifting perfume, and specifically gifting ambergris or musk-based preparations, also carried real diplomatic weight in this era. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Ottoman court, and Ottoman officials visiting foreign courts in turn, regularly exchanged luxury goods as part of formal diplomatic protocol, and fine perfumes were a genuinely common, well-documented category of these gifts precisely because their value was so universally understood across different cultures. Everybody, regardless of where they came from, recognised that ambergris and musk represented serious wealth. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight, and it's a fun one. Ottoman perfumers reportedly sometimes aged their finished perfume blends for extended periods, in some cases years, in sealed containers before considering them ready for use by the Sultan or top officials, operating on the belief, genuinely similar to modern perfumery practice incidentally, that certain fragrance blends improved, deepened, and became more harmonious with time, much the way fine wine is aged. Whether this specific extended aging practice was consistently applied across the Ottoman court, or was more the domain of particularly skilled individual perfumers experimenting with their craft, is genuinely unclear from surviving records, but the underlying principle, that a great perfume, like a great wine, benefits from patience, tracks with what we know about pre-modern perfumery traditions more broadly across the Islamic world, which had a long, genuinely sophisticated tradition of fragrance chemistry stretching back centuries before Mehmed's own era. It's worth pausing here, as your eyelids get heavier, to really sit with the scale of all this. A substance from a whale's digestive tract, aged and traded across oceans and caravan routes, blended by skilled specialists, gifted between empires as a marker of respect, eventually dabbed onto the wrist or robe of a sultan pausing between hunts. That's an extraordinary, genuinely global supply chain, all in service of a single fleeting sensory experience. Nothing about how the empire smelled at its most luxurious was simple or local. It was the product of trade routes stretching from Himalayan forests to distant ocean currents, converging quite literally on Mehmed's skin. And all of this luxury, all of this careful sensory performance of power, existed under real pressure, because being sultan, as we're about to explore, took a genuine physical and psychological toll, one that even the finest ambergris in the world couldn't entirely mask. Let's sit with the weight of the crown itself for a while now, because ruling an empire this size under this much pressure took a real toll on Mehmed, and that toll had its own particular relationship to sweat, to stress, and to the anxious superstitions of the people around him. Being sultan in this era meant sitting at the centre of an enormous, genuinely relentless set of demands. Military campaigns required decisions, funding, and leadership, even when actual battlefield command was delegated to generals and grand viziers. Court factions constantly manoeuvred for influence, requiring careful, exhausting political balancing. Religious authorities, provincial governors, foreign ambassadors, everyone wanted something, and virtually all of it eventually had to pass, at least nominally, through the Sultan himself. This is an enormous amount of sustained psychological pressure for anyone, let alone someone who had been thrust into the role as a frightened 6-year-old. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth noting. Stress-related physical symptoms were genuinely recognised, if not fully understood in modern terms, by Ottoman court physicians of this era, who observed real connections between what they might have described as excessive worry or troubled temperament and physical symptoms including disrupted sleep, digestive complaints, and yes, increased sweating. All filtered again through the humoral framework we discussed earlier, where emotional strain was understood as something that could genuinely throw the body's internal balance out of alignment. We should be careful and honest here, in the spirit of tonight's commitment to flagging what's speculative. We don't have detailed, reliable personal medical records for Mehmed specifically describing his individual stress symptoms, since this kind of intimate personal health documentation for any pre-modern ruler is extremely rare to survive, if it was ever recorded with this level of detail at all. What we're doing here is reasonable, informed extrapolation from what we know generally about the pressures of Ottoman rule during this specific period, combined with what we know about how 17th century medicine understood stress. Not a direct citation of Mehmed's own doctor documented his sweat glands on this specific date. Historians would rightly push back hard on anyone claiming more certainty than that. What is more solidly documented is the genuinely turbulent political and military backdrop of significant portions of his reign. Ongoing warfare, periodic unrest, the ever-present possibility of the kind of palace coup that had already claimed his own father's throne and life before Mehmed himself was even old enough to fully understand what had happened. Living under that kind of ambient structural danger for decades, regardless of the specific physical symptoms it may or may not have produced, represents a genuinely heavy psychological weight, one that court chroniclers and later historians alike have long recognised as shaping the anxious, sometimes paranoid undertones of Ottoman court culture during this general period. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight, tied to the superstitious atmosphere we touched on earlier. Some later Ottoman folk beliefs held that a ruler's own scent could shift, subtly, as an omen reflecting the health or misfortune of the realm itself. The idea, loosely, that a troubled reign might manifest almost mystically through a troubled body, sweat and health and fortune all bound together in the popular imagination. Again, we should flag this clearly as folk belief and later folklore rather than confirmed contemporary court records specifically tied to Mehmed, since separating genuine 17th century belief from later romanticised retelling is genuinely difficult with sources like these. But it's a beautiful, strange idea to sit with regardless. The notion that an empire's fortunes and its ruler's very body were imagined as one continuous, interconnected thing, sweat and destiny bound together. There's a genuinely poignant dimension to all of this worth acknowledging directly. For all the perfume, all the careful hygiene rituals, all the ambergris and rosewater and scent officers we've spent tonight exploring, none of it could actually touch the deeper sources of Mehmed's stress. The genuine, structural precariousness of holding onto power in a court with a documented history of deposing and executing its rulers, a war dragging on for decades, a treasury under constant strain. Scent management, in the end, was theatre performed over genuine, unmasked anxiety underneath. Beautifully, expensively performed theatre, but theatre nonetheless. And it's worth remembering, as we head deeper into tonight's story, that Mehmed wasn't managing this immense burden alone. A great deal of the actual weight of governance, especially militarily and administratively, rested on the shoulders of an extraordinarily capable family of grand viziers, the Köprülüs, whose own relationship to power, and yes, to scent and presentation, tells its own fascinating, slightly different story about what leadership actually looked and smelled like at the very top of this remarkable, complicated empire. Let's meet, properly now, the man who arguably did more to keep this empire functioning during Mehmed's reign than almost anyone else, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, and the remarkable family dynasty of Grand Viziers he founded. Appointed Grand Vizier in 1656, when he was already an elderly man well into his 70s, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha inherited an empire in genuine crisis. Military setbacks, a treasury in real trouble, factional infighting threatening to spiral out of control. What followed, and this is a genuinely well-documented mainstream historical fact, was a remarkably effective, if often ruthless period of consolidation and reform, during which Köprülü moved decisively against corruption and rival factions, stabilised the treasury, and reasserted more effective central authority over an empire that had been drifting toward real dysfunction. Here's the thing worth really sitting with. given everything we've discussed tonight about scent, status, and the performance of power. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, by most contemporary accounts, cultivated a reputation for personal austerity that stood in genuinely notable contrast to the more decoratively perfumed formality of much of the rest of the court. He was known, according to several sources, for a relatively plain, disciplined personal style, prioritising efficiency and results over ceremonial display, which in a court where perfume and presentation carried such heavy symbolic weight was itself a genuinely notable, almost pointed political statement, whether entirely intentional or simply a natural reflection of his own temperament and priorities. This creates a genuinely fascinating contrast worth exploring. While the Sultan's household maintained its scent officers and ambergris and portable rosewater sprinklers, real executive power increasingly flowed through a Grand Vizier whose own presentation leaned notably more austere. It's a reminder that the perfumed sensory performance of Ottoman rule and the actual grinding mechanics of effective governance weren't always the same thing, weren't always even located in the same person. Mehmed wore the fragrance of empire in a sense, while Köprülü and his successors did a great deal of the empire's genuinely unglamorous, difficult administrative and military work. Here's a mainstream fact about the broader Köprülü era worth knowing. After the elder Köprülü's death in 1661, his son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, succeeded him as Grand Vizier and continued this remarkably effective family dynasty of governance, leading further military campaigns and continuing the administrative reforms his father had begun. The period of Köprülü family dominance over the Grand Vizierate is generally regarded by historians as one of genuine, meaningful stabilisation for an empire that had, in the decades before, been shaken by exactly the kind of chaotic court intrigue and rapid leadership turnover we discussed earlier tonight. Here's your quirky tidbit connecting back to our scent theme. Some accounts describe Köprülü family household practices as notably more restrained in their use of imported luxury perfumes compared to typical elite Ottoman households of comparable status and wealth, a detail some historians read as a deliberate expression of the family's broader political brand of practical, disciplined, unshowy competence, essentially using restrained personal fragrance almost as a form of political messaging, a way of visually and sensorially distinguishing themselves from courtiers more associated with decorative excess. Whether this was a fully conscious branding strategy on the family's part or simply a genuine reflection of personal temperament that later observers retroactively read as strategic is, honestly, difficult to determine with real certainty from the sources available, and reasonable historians land in different places on how deliberate this actually was. What's not disputed is the genuine, substantial working relationship between Mehmed and this remarkable family of administrators, one that allowed the Sultan considerable freedom to pursue his hunting expeditions, the very ones we spent time with earlier tonight, with real confidence that the actual machinery of the empire was being competently managed in his absence. In a strange way, the Köprülü's unglamorous, restrained competence is precisely what made Mehmed's fragrant, mud-splattered wilderness escapes possible in the first place. Someone had to actually run the empire while the Sultan chased boar through Thracian forests, and for a genuinely significant stretch of his reign, that someone did the job remarkably well. But even the most capable administration has its limits, and empires under sustained military and financial strain eventually show real cracks, regardless of how skilled the people managing the crisis happen to be. And it's toward those cracks, toward the beginning of the end of Mehmed's long, complicated reign, that we're going to turn next. Let's follow the threads now toward decline, because even the most carefully managed empire, run by even the most capable administrators, eventually meets genuine limits, and Mehmed's reign, for all its length, was no exception. By the later stretch of Mehmed's rule, the empire faced a series of genuinely serious military setbacks. The long war with the Habsburgs in Central Europe, and particularly the catastrophic failure of the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683, marked a genuinely significant turning point, not just militarily, but symbolically, shattering an aura of Ottoman military dominance that had shaped European perceptions of the empire for generations. This is a well-established mainstream historical fact. The failure at Vienna triggered a cascading series of further military reversals across the following years, as a coalition of European powers pressed their advantage, and Ottoman forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive across multiple fronts simultaneously. These military failures had real, direct political consequences back in Istanbul. Military defeat, in the Ottoman political culture of this era, was never treated as a purely external, abstract event. It reflected, in the eyes of the court and increasingly the broader population, on the legitimacy and competence of the Sultan himself, regardless of how much actual battlefield decision-making he personally controlled. Blame for the deteriorating military situation increasingly gathered around Mehmed, fairly or not, and the political ground beneath his throne began, quite genuinely, to shift. Here's where our smell-focused lens actually connects to something genuinely documented. Contemporary accounts describe growing unrest and anxiety within the palace and among the Janissary corps, the empire's elite military political force, whose loyalty or disloyalty had repeatedly proven decisive in the fates of previous sultans during this period of military crisis. And in an environment already primed, as we discussed earlier, to read scent and hygiene disruption as omens of trouble, the genuine chaos of a court under real political strain would have manifested in exactly the kinds of sensory disruptions that era's superstitions were primed to notice. Hastily called meetings running late into exhausted nights, disrupted normal palace routines including the careful bathing and perfuming rituals we've spent so much time on tonight. An atmosphere, quite literally, of things falling out of their usual careful order. We should be honest and careful here, flagging clearly what's disputed. We don't have a specific, reliable primary source stating plainly that the palace smelled distinctly of panic during this period. That's a poetic, interpretive framing this narration is offering you, not a direct historical quotation. What we do have, solidly, is documentation of genuine institutional breakdown, disrupted normal court functioning, and rising political tension, and it's a reasonable, if inherently somewhat speculative, extension to imagine that the careful, ritualised sensory management of palace life would have frayed right alongside everything else during a period of this much genuine crisis. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight. Genuinely documented rather than speculative. Ottoman court protocol during periods of acknowledged crisis or mourning sometimes included the deliberate temporary suspension of certain luxury practices, including reduced use of elaborate perfumes and simplified personal presentation, as a formal, visible expression of gravity and concern appropriate to the moment, essentially a kind of sensory austerity performed deliberately, the inverse of all that careful, fragrant display we've spent the evening exploring. Whether this specific protocol was formally invoked during Mehmed's own final crisis-ridden years is not something we can confirm with full certainty from available sources, but the broader practice of deliberate sensory austerity during acknowledged court crises is genuinely documented in Ottoman ceremonial tradition more broadly. By 1687, following yet another significant military defeat, the Janissary corps and key court officials had lost confidence in Mehmed's continued rule entirely. This is where our story's political climax actually arrives, and it arrives, characteristically for this particular reign, without much ceremony or grandeur, a quiet, grinding erosion of support finally reaching its breaking point, rather than some single dramatic betrayal. Remember that image from the very start of tonight's story. The young sultan riding hard through misty forests, sweat-soaked, chasing something he could actually catch, in a world where so much else felt uncontrollable. By 1687, the uncontrollable parts of his world had finally caught up with him entirely. The hunting could no longer offer any real escape from what was coming. And what was coming, as we were about to hear, was the end of Mehmed IV's reign as Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, a deposition that would close one chapter of this story and open its final, quieter, considerably sadder one. Let's stay with this moment now, because 1687 is where the empire's mounting cracks finally became a full, genuine break. Mehmed IV's deposition, the formal end of his reign as Sultan. Here's the mainstream historical fact at the centre of tonight's chapter. In November of 1687, following the continued military reversals and mounting political dissatisfaction we discussed a moment ago, Mehmed IV was deposed by a coalition of Janissary and court officials, and his brother was installed as the new Sultan, taking the name Suleiman II. This was, by the standards of Ottoman succession crises, actually a relatively bloodless transition compared to some of the more violent depositions in the empire's history. Mehmed himself was not executed, unlike his own father decades earlier, but was instead confined, stripped of his political power, while his physical life, at least initially, was spared. This distinction matters, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Ottoman succession crises across the centuries ranged enormously in their brutality, and the relatively restrained handling of Mehmed's own deposition, confinement rather than execution, reflects, historians generally agree, a broader evolution in Ottoman political culture by this period, where deposition without execution had become a more commonly accepted, if still severe, way of resolving a sultan's loss of legitimacy, rather than reaching immediately for the kind of lethal resolution that had characterised some earlier succession struggles, including, again, the fate of Mehmed's own father. Here's where our sensory lens genuinely applies, and this part is documented rather than speculative. The actual physical process of deposition involved a formal, ritualised transfer of power with specific protocols governing how the outgoing sultan was to be treated, housed and presented during the transition. Mehmed was moved from his position at the absolute centre of palace ceremony and its accompanying sensory world, the scent officers, the finest ambergris, the elaborate hammam rituals reserved specifically for the reigning sultan, into a more restricted, confined existence within the palace complex, stripped of the ceremonial trappings that had defined his entire adult sensory experience of what it meant to actually be sultan. Try to sit with that shift for a moment, because it's genuinely striking when you consider everything we've discussed tonight. This was a man whose entire life, from infancy, had been structured around careful, constant sensory management, perfumed swaddling cloths as a baby, ritual bathing before every ceremonial appearance as a child, scent officers managing his presentation as an adult, portable rosewater sprinklers following him even into the mud and blood of the hunting field. And now, in a matter of days, all of that carefully maintained sensory world of power was simply, abruptly withdrawn. The rosewater didn't follow him into confinement the way it had followed him into the forests. Here's your quirky tidbit for tonight, genuinely poignant rather than merely strange. Ottoman court protocol for confined former sultans generally maintained a baseline standard of care and dignity, appropriate to someone still, technically, a member of the imperial family. Mehmed would not have been thrown into genuine squalor, but the qualitative difference between sultan and confined former sultan, in terms of the luxury goods, personal attendance, and elaborate ceremonial presentation available to him, would have been genuinely enormous and immediate. Historians studying palace expenditure records from comparable depositions note real, sharp drops in the allocation of luxury goods to deposed rulers' new, more restricted quarters, a documented pattern that would very plausibly have applied to Mehmed's own situation as well, even without a specific surviving ledger entry confirming every detail of his particular case. It's worth acknowledging directly, in the spirit of intellectual honesty tonight's story has tried to maintain throughout, that we genuinely don't have detailed personal accounts of how Mehmed himself experienced this transition emotionally, in his own words. No diary, no confirmed personal letters describing his interior state as the fragrant ceremonial world he'd known his entire life was stripped away. What we have is the documented external record of deposition and confinement, and a reasonable, historically grounded inference about what that transition likely meant for a man whose entire identity had been so thoroughly wrapped up in the sensory performance of rule. He would live for several more years after his deposition, largely out of public view, in circumstances that grew, as we're about to hear, increasingly difficult. A final chapter, considerably quieter and considerably sadder than the vivid hunting expeditions and perfumed ceremonies that had defined so much of his life before this. Let's turn there now, gently, as the pacing of tonight's story continues to slow toward its close. Let's move gently now into the quietest, saddest part of tonight's story. Mehmed's final years, spent in confinement, away from the perfumed ceremony and open forest that had defined so much of his life before. Following his deposition in 1687, Mehmed IV was confined within the palace complex in Edirne, a city he had, in something almost like a strange, sad irony, always genuinely loved. Edirne had been one of his favourite retreats specifically because of its proximity to good hunting grounds, and now it became instead the site of his quiet imprisonment. This is a documented mainstream historical fact. He spent his remaining years there, largely removed from political affairs, his movements and access to the outside world significantly restricted compared to the enormous freedom he'd enjoyed as sultan. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence about his physical circumstances during this period, extrapolating carefully from what we know about comparable Ottoman royal confinements of the era. His basic material needs would have continued to be met, since even a deposed sultan remained a member of the imperial family whose treatment reflected on the dynasty's own dignity. But the elaborate, constant sensory management that had defined his adult life, the scent officers, the finest ambergris, the ritual bathing before every appearance, would have been dramatically scaled back, replaced by a far more modest, restricted daily existence. Mehmed died in 1693, several years into his confinement. Historians generally attribute his death to natural causes related to declining health, though, as with much surrounding this final period of his life, the specific details are not extensively documented in surviving sources, and there's genuinely less rich material available for these final years compared to the vividly chronicled decades of his actual reign. This itself tells you something quietly sad and true. Deposed rulers, once removed from active power, tended to fade quickly from the detailed attention of court chroniclers, whose interests and resources were, understandably, redirected toward documenting the new reigning sultan instead. Mehmed's final years exist in the historical record as something considerably closer to a fading echo than the vivid, richly detailed narrative available for his decades of active rule. Here's your quirky, genuinely poignant tidbit for tonight. Given what we've explored throughout this entire evening about how deeply Mehmed's identity was bound up with the sensory world of hunting specifically, the mud, the sweat, the open air, the honest physical exertion he seemed, by some accounts, to genuinely prefer over perfumed court formality, his confinement likely represented a loss that went well beyond simply losing political power. It meant losing access to the very physical sensory experience that seemed to have brought him something like genuine peace throughout his adult life. We can't know for certain how he personally experienced this loss, since no confirmed personal account survives to tell us directly, but it's a genuinely resonant human thing to sit with as we approach the end of his story tonight. A man who found something like freedom in mud and forest air, confined at the end of his life to rooms he could not leave. There is real scholarly debate, worth mentioning honestly, about how to properly weigh Mehmed's overall reign and legacy, given how dramatically different its two phases were. The earlier decades of relatively effective, Köprülü-supported governance and genuine imperial stability, contrasted against the later years of mounting military crisis, growing unpopularity, and eventual deposition. Some historians emphasize the earlier stability as the more historically significant achievement of his reign, arguing the later crisis reflected broader structural pressures on the empire that would likely have challenged any ruler, regardless of personal competence. Others place more weight on the later crisis and deposition as the defining, ultimately more consequential arc of his rule. This is a genuinely unresolved historical debate, not a question with a single settled answer, and reasonable historians land in meaningfully different places on it. What we can say, gently, as we close this particular chapter of tonight's story is this. Mehmed IV lived a life defined at every stage by an intense, carefully managed relationship with scent and sensation, perfumed as an infant, bathed ritually before every childhood ceremony, misted with rosewater between kills in muddy forests, managed by an entire bureaucratic apparatus of scent officers at the very height of his power. And he ended that same life in the comparative sensory quiet of confinement, far from almost all of it. There's something genuinely moving in that full arc, something worth sitting with as your own eyes grow heavier tonight. And now, gently, let's turn toward how history actually chose to remember him. Let's ease now gently toward the close of tonight's story, and think together about what history actually remembers when it remembers Mehmed IV, and what that remembering can tell us about this whole strange, fragrant, complicated journey we've taken together tonight. Mehmed IV occupies a genuinely mixed, still debated place in Ottoman historical memory. He's remembered, on one hand, as Avcı, the hunter, a nickname that, as we discussed, carries both genuine affection for a memorable personal passion and a quieter, more critical undertone about priorities. Some contemporaries and later historians felt he misplaced. He's remembered, too, as the Sultan, under whose reign the Köprülü family achieved genuine, meaningful administrative stabilization, an accomplishment historians generally credit substantially to that remarkable family of grand viziers, but which also required, from Mehmed himself, the genuine political wisdom to grant them real authority and support their reforms, rather than obstructing them out of jealousy or insecurity. which lesser rulers in his position might well have done. And he's remembered, unavoidably, as the Sultan deposed following the catastrophic failure at Vienna and the mounting military crises that followed, a symbolic marker in the broader sweep of Ottoman history of the empire's gradual complicated transition away from the era of seemingly unstoppable expansion that had characterized earlier centuries toward a longer, more difficult period of adaptation and, eventually, genuine internal reform efforts in the centuries that followed. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth closing on. Historians today generally resist the older, simpler narrative that once framed Mehmed primarily as a lazy, hunting-obsessed sultan, single-handedly responsible for imperial decline, recognizing instead that the pressures facing the Ottoman Empire during this period were genuinely structural and complex, tied to shifting European military technology and alliance patterns, economic pressures, and broader currents well beyond what any single ruler's personal habits could have fully caused or prevented. This more careful, nuanced modern view doesn't erase Mehmed's real flaws and real responsibility as a ruler, but it does resist reducing an entire complicated reign to a single simplified moral lesson about a man who loved hunting a bit too much. And tonight, we've tried something a little different with his story. We've tried to follow him through smell, through hygiene, through the endlessly documented, genuinely fascinating sensory world of perfumes and bathhouses and scent officers and rosewater sprinklers that surrounded him from infancy to deposition. It's a strange lens, maybe, for understanding a historical figure, but it's told us something genuinely true, I think, that power, in this world, was never purely abstract. It was worn on the skin, breathed in through incense smoke, carried in small pouches of ambergris, scrubbed away with ash soap in marble bathhouses, and eventually, quietly, stripped away entirely in the comparative sensory silence of confinement. We followed him from a perfumed infancy through a childhood shaped by fierce women fighting for his throne, through a hammam culture more sophisticated and more seriously considered than most people ever learn about, out into muddy Thracian forests, where he seemed, by some accounts, to have found something like real peace, through the careful, restrained competence of the Köprülü family, who kept his empire running while he hunted, through the mounting crisis and eventual fall that closed his active reign, and finally into the quiet, fading final years that history barely bothered to document at all. That's the whole shape of a human life, really, isn't it? Fragrant beginnings, complicated middles, a quiet, under-documented end. Remember the rosewater sprinklers from the very start of tonight's story, misting a sweat-soaked, mud-flecked sultan pausing briefly in the middle of a hunt. Remember the crocodile dung legend we gently set aside as folklore rather than fact. Remember the scent officers, an entire bureaucratic department dedicated to making power smell exactly the way power was supposed to smell. Hold all of it loosely now, the way you'd hold the last images of a dream just before it fades. You've travelled a long way tonight, through incense-thick palace corridors, through steaming marble bathhouses, through forests thick with mud and blood and rosewater, through the anxious, perfumed politics of a court that measured favour partly in fragrance, all the way to the quiet, fading rooms of a confined former sultan, whose story history mostly stopped bothering to tell. Let it all settle now. Let your breathing slow. There's nothing left to chase tonight. No throne to defend, no forest to ride through. Just the soft hum of whatever's keeping you company in the dark, and the last fading scent of rosewater drifting off into sleep. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.